Hello and welcome to the AMCP podcast series, Listen Up, as we take a deep dive into the challenges, trends, and opportunities in managed care pharmacy. Follow the show's social hashtag at AMCP Listen Up, and to learn more about AMCP, visit amcp.org. I'm your host, Fred Goldstein. On this episode, my guest is Sarah Iman, the CEO of ICER. Welcome, Sarah.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks, Fred.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to get you on. Why don't we get a little bit of your background, and then we can get into ICER and what they do.
Certainly. I came to this work in a roundabout way, which I think is common for people who end up in a health policy job like I have. I thought I was going to be a doctor, worked in a hospital, didn't really like it that much, ended up working actually in the biopharmaceutical industry for about a decade, doing corporate communications and investor relations, and then found my way to a graduate program to get a degree in public policy with a concentration in health policy, and got very lucky that I got introduced to Steve Pearson, ICER's founder, right when I was finishing graduate school. And so I joined ICER right when I finished my graduate program back in 2009.
That's fantastic. An interesting roundabout way to kind of come into this thing with some really good background you brought in. So talk a little about what you do and what ICER does.
ICER conducts what's known internationally as health technology assessment. Not really a common term in the U.S. healthcare system, but it's this idea that we can bring a distinct approach to analyzing evidence on both the benefits and the costs to try to determine what a fair price is for what we pay for in the healthcare system. So it's distinct from what we do with the FDA. The FDA is looking at safety and efficacy. This is really about comparative effectiveness research and cost effectiveness analysis. And we are an independent nonprofit that just puts this information out there to try to get the healthcare system to do a little bit better about paying for value.
Yeah, so this really is an opportunity to say, here's the value if you're looking as we move towards what's supposedly going to be a value-based care system, right?
It is. It's a way to think about price as a function of value, which in a lot of parts of our healthcare system, they're kind of divorced, especially in the pharmaceutical space where there's a government-granted monopoly and there's no regulation of how much our manufacturers can charge. Having an independent analysis of the evidence to say, wait a minute, how much better is this drug than what we already do, and how much should we pay for that? It gives a really nice signal back to the system that says, hey, if you bring a drug to market that has a really big benefit for patients, you can command a really high price tag for that. But if your drug's just about as good as what we're already doing, maybe you might be overreaching on price, and maybe we should have a conversation.
So when you think of value, how are you determining value? Because obviously it's different to each player in the healthcare system.
So what we do is we take a population health perspective, and we use a health system perspective and sometimes a modified societal perspective. But we're basically asking the question, how much better does this drug make a patient feel? And how much longer do they live if it's a life-limiting condition? And then how much does that cost? And how much do we save? There are so many other aspects of value that are important. And we do capture those in what we call other benefits, or benefits beyond health, that are really important in a deliberative process, which is another distinctive part of our work. We have a public meeting to talk about our work so that decision makers ultimately have all of this information and when they're making a decision about price and access. But yes, value definitely can be in the eye of the beholder. We're not trying to be the be-all and end-all of capturing every ounce of value that a new intervention brings to the healthcare system. We're trying to think about it distinctively from a population health perspective.
Right. And one of the fascinating things that I've been watching more recently is we've been getting these higher and higher cost drugs and now these genetic approaches. And those are being obviously sent, and you're looking at these very closely to determine their value.
We are. And what's so fascinating about where we are is I consider this really interesting moment of science fiction becoming reality. My first job in biotech was at a company that was sequencing the human genome over 20 years ago. And we were like, maybe one day we'll live to see these types of therapies. And here we are. And this is innovation to celebrate. But we have a payment system that hasn't really gotten ready to pay for all of that value in a one-time treatment. A lot of the reviews that we've done of these genetic therapies, these gene therapies, has actually shown these price tags are pretty fair in the millions of dollars. And yet we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to pay for these.
Right, because what you've determined is that value over the life of the individual qualities, right? And then we have a payment system and a health insurance system in which people change plans, et cetera, that makes it very difficult to then integrate that back into the system.
We have a healthcare system that's done a really good job of paying for chronic therapy because that's just what we've had for so long. And we figured out all of these ways to manage it from an actuarial perspective, from a premium perspective. And here we are with this challenge in front of us. And I think we can meet this challenge. We actually have some recommendations coming out about how we can do this well.
Oh, that'll be fascinating. So when do you expect that?
That'll be out on April 23rd.
Really? We can't get a primer, a little early access?
Oh, absolutely. Happy to give you the quick overview. Well, to manage everyone's expectations, we don't have the silver bullet for how we're going to fix this. We do talk about everything from value-based pricing to outcomes-based arrangements to warranties to risk pooling to reinsurance. We think the path forward in the near term is to think about stacking some of these approaches together. And so instead of just focusing on, hey, I'm going to just do an outcomes-based contract, you might want to have an outcomes-based contract that's also paired with a joining a risk pool or being part of a having some reinsurance that might protect you from a lightning strike, as they call it. And so I don't have the final answer, so to speak, but I do know that we have an opportunity in front of us to really experiment with these different approaches in a way that will, at the end of the day, make sure that the patients who could benefit from these therapies have access.
Yeah, I know from the payer side, I was looking at some of this and saying to myself, boy, given the price of that product, a 385 life group essentially spends their entire annual premium on the product. So obviously your ideas around pooling the risk, et cetera, are critically important.
What we heard when we talked to a lot of different purchasers, payers, clinicians, patients, manufacturers was that smaller, fully insured plans or lives, they're going to be okay. It's kind of built into the premium. The really big companies, they're also going to be okay because they've got the reserves for this. It's that medium-sized, self-insured employer who's really scared about what happens if they've got, one child born with spinal muscular atrophy and all of a sudden they've got a bill for a therapy that's about the same as they pay for an entire year for their prescription benefit. Those are the ones that are challenged right now.
Mm-hmm. So we're at the AMCP annual conference.
We are.
You're going to be part of a presentation on managed care pharmacy and patient engagement. How are you looking at patient engagement? How does that fit within what ICER does?
Well, it's been an evolution. I'm happy to report, or I don't mind reporting, that we weren't really good at it when we started. When we first started doing these comparative effectiveness reviews, we were looking at the clinical data that were produced by the companies. We were talking to the companies and maybe a few clinical experts. And we thought that was adequate in terms of capturing what was important to patients. And boy, did the patient community help us know that we had a lot to learn. And we're so grateful for the ways that the patient community has educated us about how we can do better. And what we've really evolved to do is have a very distinctive approach to capturing the perspective of patients and their families in our reviews. What outcomes matter to them? What do they want out of therapy? What don't they like about the therapy that they're on now? What other things beyond health are impacted by their disease or could be improved by a therapy that works for them? And we have those conversations with patients, their families, patient advocacy organizations throughout our entire 8-month review process. And then at the very end of that process, we are really proud to put the patients, their families, and the patient advocates center in our meetings so that we can make sure that when we're having maybe some nerdy conversations about statistics or about cost effectiveness, that we don't lose sight that we're really trying to stay focused on how we can make sure these patients have access to these therapies.
Wow, I think about what you just talked about, and I think, as the rest of the industry is beginning to say, hey, we need to put this patient in the center, as I saw in your presentation, but that's really not it. It's much more about getting that voice into the system, right? And then adjusting what you're doing to that voice.
It is, and I'll tell you, one of the things that I learned through this work that was probably the most frustrating thing that I heard when we started working more closely with patients is how frustrated they felt when they would look at an ICER review and they wouldn't see any of the outcomes that mattered to them anywhere in our review. And I said, I'm frustrated too, but we're relying on the evidence that's produced by the manufacturers of these drugs. And so what we really need to do as a system, and this is where there's been leadership from the FDA that we're really excited to see through the patient-focused drug development program, is make sure that the developers are asking patients and their families what they care about so that they're embedded in the clinical trial programs. Because then when it comes time to do the health technology assessment, then we've got the data and we can really answer the question about how much better these drugs are about the outcomes that matter to patients.
And my assumption is you're beginning to have an effect and see that occur now at the manufacturer level.
Absolutely. In fact, our most recent update to our value assessment framework, we committed to offering manufacturers the opportunity to provide us a summary of how they engaged patients and patient advocacy organizations in the development of the clinical trial program. We think we can platform some of the best practices that are happening out there because some companies are doing a really great job at this, making sure that it's embedded in their clinical trial program, making sure that they're validating those outcomes. And I'm really excited to continue to platform some of the best practices so that we can continue to improve in this area.
That's great. So where does ICER go from here?
Well, I've been with ICER for over 14 years, and I've gotten that question a lot since I've taken over as president and CEO, and I don't want to disappoint anyone. We're not changing the vision and the strategy very dramatically because I've been there. It's been my privilege to work with Steve and to be building ICER with him over these years. I will say 3 things keep me up at night as we look towards the future, and we've touched on one of them. Paying for cell and gene therapies. I don't want to screw this up. If we don't figure out how to pay for this in a sustainable way, we're going to send an innovation signal back that says, okay, never mind, don't develop these. And that would be a travesty. So all the ways we can contribute to continuing to figure out how to value the therapies appropriately, price them appropriately, and then pay for them appropriately so ultimately patients have access. The other is health equity. We did a white paper on ways that health technology assessment can be more responsive to the evolving health equity landscape. And we now have a clinical trial diversity rating that we include in all of our work, again, to send a signal back to industry about how to be, where there are best practices, about how to have a more diverse patient population in clinical trials, all the way to what we call the Health Improvement Distribution Index. This is a way to say, hey, if we invest in this therapy, it disproportionately impacts people who have historically been disadvantaged by the healthcare system. So we might want to do that as a society, as sort of overinvest in this area to help try and reduce those disparities. So that's top of mind. And the third is really thinking about if there's one entity in this entire system that I think has the leverage to get us all to do better, right? Because I often think about where we are as an arms race between manufacturers and health plans and PBMs and, oh, I want a bigger rebate and, oh, my list price has to go higher. I think it's the employers. I think they're the ones who can get us all to do better, so to speak. And so ways that we can continue to educate and activate the employer community, because ultimately they're the ones who want both broad access for their employees, but also an affordable healthcare system, right? So that they can do things like give people raises and build new manufacturing plants. And so work with the purchasers is high on my list.
So that leads to a question. Having spent a fair amount of time working with and talking with self-insured employers, these large employers, I don't know that I've ever seen any of them mention an ICER report per se. So what are you doing in that area? Because I think that's fantastic.
I think that you're right. Not many of them know, but here's the dynamic that you're more familiar with than anyone. There's a fair amount of reliance on other experts, right? They're relying on their benefit consultants. They're relying on their PBMs to give them advice on this in this area. And that's, I think, been the way it's worked previously. So what we've been doing is talking to some purchaser coalitions, places where they've been thinking about this issue. We've been talking, I have to admit, to some of the disruptive PBMs. That's an area where I think that some purchasers are starting to pay a little more attention than the traditional PBM route. And we've been, having conversations with some of the big employers about ways that they might want to use our research again to try to get more affordable access for their employees. So we'll just keep having those conversations.
Well, that's fantastic. Really a great overview of what you're doing. I think the work ICER does and the health technology assessments are incredible. As I learned about them years ago and started reading them, I said, wow, this is really a fascinating way to look at this information so we can move to this value-based care world in a rational approach.
I feel very fortunate that I get to do the work that I do, and I'm having lots of fun. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us today. If you like this show, you can find all our episodes at amcp.org/podcast, on our show page at healthcarenowradio.com, or on your favorite listening platform by searching Healthcare Now Radio. You can follow our show's social hashtag at AMCPListenUp, and don't forget to share, like, and follow AMCP.org on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm Fred Goldstein for AMCP. Until next time.